Good morning to everybody. I can tell we're kind of a patchwork group. That's okay because Mr. Todd left me a lot of material to cover, so maybe we'll, in a smaller group, be able to cover a little more of it. We say the same thing in the men's study. It doesn't always happen, though, with fewer people because you get the time to explore more ideas and things of that nature. But anyway, yes, sir. So anyway, Mr. Todd is out, and we are just going to pick up where he left off. I guess he sent y'all the email, so you're kind of familiar with the last week material already. The section I'm supposed to cover is basically the one that's called the miscellaneous laws, so there's not really any continuity in there. It's sort of hit and miss, one on this subject and one on the other subject. So we get there, God willing, we will talk more about the principles behind those things, because I think that'll help us maybe with the clarity and everything. But before we get started this morning, we can open with a prayer if the mics permit. So if I'm not mistaken, he just got into the lesson 7 last week, and I think I had marked number 2. If you have something different, you can let me know. All right, so for number 2, Todd had the question here, what tests of a prophet are considered here in Deuteronomy 13 and 18, and which test was it that mattered the most? So I guess we might get that before we go to the comparison that follows. But what was this basis of acceptance for a prophet's message? Yes, sir. This is true. Playing into this text, though, there were some times that it did come true and they weren't supposed to listen to him. And what was the criteria to consider there? Yeah. If he says the sun rises in the morning and I'm a prophet and the sun rises, it doesn't mean that you can listen to him and go follow the other gods. So what God is trying to say here is, of the many things that I might ask you to do, not following me is never going to be one of them. So you don't ever entertain that concept, because it was bound to happen, the same way that we do have in the New Testament. He also touches Deuteronomy 18 there and asks, which one of these criteria mattered the most? And that might be a little subjective, but all the tests mattered, right?
If what they said came to pass or not.
Yeah. But again, that wasn't, still, if it was somebody that was going to be misleading them or something, that person's supposed to be put to death. So he asks how that compares to what was our instruction in 1 John 4 and Galatians 1, which I'm sure you're familiar with that concept, test the spirits, right, whether they be of God. And how are we supposed to do that? We don't have the gifts of the Spirit, as it were, so how do we measure this person? Yes, sir?
If what they say coincides with what we find in the Scriptures, if they say something contrary, then we know they're not from God.
Right. And so the example given in John, where there was people going around and teaching that, that Christ had not come in the flesh. There were some people, I spoke to you recently about worldviews, and they just had this worldview that flesh was so innately evil that there's no way like deity could possess that form because it was just too contradictory in its nature. So they're just people that couldn't accept that. And so they were teaching other people, to not accept that. In Galatians, the warning that is given is that they're so soon removed from the gospel of Christ to this other gospel, but Paul says it's not really another gospel, it's just some perverted the actual gospel. So how would you give a perversion of the gospel besides say Jesus Christ didn't come in the flesh? There's 1,000 ways to contaminate the pure thing, right? There's a whole lot of different things you could put in my drinking water that would make me not want to drink it. But the only way you know the perversion or the untruth is if you know the word, consistently to measure it by. Because we talked about that recently too. Some people take what Paul says, and there's a lot of ongoing attacks on Paul, by the way. Like people trying to dissolve him of his authority or having any say-so. And I was just reading something again this week, some article on that. People try to dismiss him and undermine him, which I find strange. But nonetheless, they'll say this apostle contradicts this apostle, and what do you do? Anyway, that's a twisted understanding or a misunderstanding because somebody doesn't have this, whole counsel on an issue by which to measure the consistency. So anyway, in summary, yes, if what the prophet said came to pass and it wasn't involving the following of other gods, that would be the test of accepting that person. Number 3 says, what does Deuteronomy 14:21 reveal about God's reason for some of the laws that Israel had to keep that a foreigner did not have to keep? And I thought you raised your hand. I thought you were on it. Oh, go for it. You got halfway there. I'm going to take it.
Israel was a holy people to God, is what's emphasized.
Mm-hmm. So even though it was permissible for something that was dead of itself, just died out in the field, we do that with roadkill. Actually, I think somebody kills her. You don't want the one that's been laying there for a couple days, right? But if you were to hit your own, well, you could take it. But the argument that God has given here is that yes, that's for other people, but that's not for my people, and that's what you're saying. He's just making a distinguishing line between his people and the stranger or the alien. So it's just a higher bar, I guess, for his people to reach towards. Number 4, what does God emphasize that they should do for the poor? And he says compare Deuteronomy 15 and Jesus' statement in Matthew 26, and then to look at what Moses' comment on the law was. Well, what did God ask them to do for the poor in Deuteronomy 15 there?
Open their hand widely and help them out.
Mm-hmm. And was this the same context where he said that, if it's approaching year of Jubilee and they're fixing to get everything back, and so you feel like you don't have to be compassionate because everything's fixing to be restored to them, and he says it would be a sin unto you to do that? It's worded in other places, like if it's within your power to do it, if it's in your possession and you have what the person needs, there's really no excuse to withhold it. We probably see Jesus' emphasis on that probably the best in that parable of the Good Samaritan. Clearly that individual had the capability to apply the assistance immediately, but he delivered him somewhere else and left the money there for what care and provision that person needed until he passed back through. And some people may not be able to go to that limit, but the point is whatever ability you have the responsibility to exercise. So he said it would be a sin unto them to withhold that aid. The next part of the question, in the comparison with Deuteronomy 15:11 and Jesus' statement, there's kind of a word that's used there I think Todd's looking for to draw the comparison. Did you catch it? I think the word was always. And that's exactly what Jesus said in Matthew, was the poor you have with you always. Remember Judas asked him the question, why wasn't this fragrance sold and that money given to the poor? And Jesus' answer was, well, you always have the poor with you, but me you do not have always, and she has done this for my burial. So I think what Todd's trying to show here and get us to see is that in the Old Testament, there were always going to be the poor among them. And in this New Testament time, or the time of Jesus, he's saying the same thing. The poor are always going to be with you. There's always going to be somebody who has a need. And so I think that's what he was wanting us to catch right there. So what is the comparison with what Moses says? Moses said, the poor shall never cease. Moses said the same thing. It's just never going to come to pass a time when there are no poor among us that would not need some help. Yes, sir.
This seems to point to this underlying idea of the ulterior motive. All of this associated with helping somebody else, and no matter what it is, whether it's poverty or just spiritual needs or whatever, it always goes back to this idea of the ulterior motive. Do you have an ulterior motive for doing this? The answer should be no. You should do it because it needs to be done and you have the ability to do it. You're in the place, the time. You're the one. You're at the front of the line. And if we count the ulterior motive piece of it, you're always going to have an excuse for something.
And those same religious leaders, that Jesus condemned for this kind of thing, they did it to be seen of men. So they had their reward. They had the praise of men. That was going to be their reward. But didn't Jesus say, whatever you do, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing? Right? And I think that's kind of what you're talking about. If your motive is pure, it's not going to be for show or for attention or for the approval of man, but rather for the approval of God. All right. The next question he had here is regarding the feasts and the Hebrew dates and the modern months and the purpose and the reminder behind that. The three particular ones he was talking about here is, the Passover, the Feast of the Weeks, which we might know as the Pentecost, and then this one of the Booths or the Tabernacles. And I guess, the calendar thing you can figure out. I had to look all that up, but is there anybody that didn't have that we want to have that discussion, or we want to just look at the purpose and the reminders, what they were supposed to remember by these feast days? So what was the purpose of the Passover? What were they bringing to their remembrance every year when they did the Passover? Mm-hmm. And so they had been, slaves. They had been strangers in a strange land, right? And he wants them, I guess, to remember that and how that he delivered them with a strong hand, just to keep it as a cultural reminder. Right. And I mean, like we have our own and traditions, right? We have a Thanksgiving or something, once a year that was instituted in this country to give thanks, to God and et cetera. And we're supposed to do that with the annual reminder. I think God would like to be thanked more than once a year, though, right? You think so? Maybe, huh? So now about the Feast of the Weeks, this is drawing our attention to what?
Celebration of the first fruits of the wheat harvest.
And so that's again kind of a recognition of where everything comes from, right? Back to God again. I didn't see that one. I didn't see it. Where is it named? Where is it called that? You don't remember? Okay, I'll write that down.
Some of these feasts have names associated with
Tabernacles and booths and right. Okay, I'll look that one up. Yes, sir.
These two feasts in particular have civil or civic connotations to them also, because when we get into the taxing and all those kinds of things and stuff that keeps the government going and the nation, these are important parts. This is the first ones, and then there are taxes that come and contributions associated with this, and as is with the last one.
And generally all that was to keep the Levites and the priesthood going, to keep God's work going. And the things that they obviously gave, like you're saying, these first fruits, they had their portion left behind, and then several things we'll come up to in this miscellaneous laws section was about the gleaning. Linda can tell you a whole lot about gleaning because she's part of a gleaning co-op. It's a very fascinating organization. I think it's a very interesting concept, and it really works out as a positive for everybody. But the Israelites were supposed to leave things behind for the stranger, the sojourner, the poor, the widows, the fatherless, and we'll come up to that here in a little bit. The third one was the feast about the booths, and what was the purpose behind that one? What are we trying to remember with this one?
the wandering in the wilderness, temporary tents, shelters.
Right. So in other words, they hadn't reached the promised land yet. Now if we take this by metaphor, by extension to our New Testament, like always remembering that the Old Testament is actually the shadow. That's the one that's a little harder to decipher. What we have now is the real. And if this body that we're in is called, a tabernacle, and we sing a song that says, "This world is not my home, I'm just passing through," we're supposed to be pilgrims or sojourners in our life. And I think that there's a mindset behind that, because I think the more and more established we get on our one little peace in our one little place, we become more maybe falsely secure, a little maybe more confident. And so I think there's a huge benefit in that concept of understanding that, I don't really belong here. I'm headed somewhere else, and that probably is to help them have that focus again on fellow man and helping them out. But that's a hard way to live, because you're dependent on, every day they woke up, God had to send the manna, God sent the quail, God gave the water. It's a constant remembrance that God was the provider. Israel gets in the land, they get set up, and it's one of the, I can't remember if it's Haggai, Habakkuk, or Hosea, one of the H's, isn't it? That says, you went kind of whoring with the nations round about you, and I'm going to put the hedge there, my oil, my flax. You have this idea that this is yours and what you procured for yourself, and you forgot where it came from. So I think that's one thing that's supposed to be embedded in their culture to help them remember again where the things come from.
Prayer, give us this day our daily bread, that daily dependence.
Yeah. That is correct. It was like the widow with the 2 mites, right? That's what was so significant about her contribution was she had what she needed for the day, what she had left for that day she gave to God in full faith that she was going to wake up tomorrow and that God was going to take care of her again. And that is big. And that's why they were confused when God said she gave, or Jesus said that she gave more than all the rest of them did because, well, she gave 100%. She gave everything that she had. So percentage-wise, it was quite a bit. All right, number 6. What are the commands for a king of Israel to do and to not do? And what examples come to mind of kings that should have heeded these instructions? So it's a pretty short list there, but what were a couple of things they were not supposed to do for themselves?
Or that he doesn't need to be busy with his own business, breeding the horses, making money, maybe trading, and obviously do not convince people to return to Egypt, but stay in the promised land. But he is supposed to write his own law, make copy to be sure he remembers it, and not marry many wives.
Well, you just put that one in there. Yeah. So where does Solomon follow on that one, right? Not multiplying to himself wives. But that again is, the thing with the horses is what? I mean, it actually gives kind of a reason there in that verse. And I love it when the reason is there, because sometimes we scratch our head and just say, well, maybe God's just, drawing a line here and we can't understand it. But he gives some reasoning there, and obviously the wives, and at least in Solomon's case, because they were foreign wives, they did pull him away from God, and he wound up building altars and whatnot to these other gods on their behalf. Drawing from the other one that you said, though, it said he was supposed to write his own copy of the law. Didn't you find that fascinating? Wouldn't you think, as the head of state, you could just have a secretary do that for you? But have you ever had to do that in school? You write something, and because you wrote it, you might remember it.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you write it down yourself, you're probably going to, some of it's going to stick in there, and you're going to pay attention instead of just, oh, here's the document that has all the law, okay.
So anyway, I found that extremely fascinating, but that it fell back on the king as one of the things he was supposed to do.
You think about how many kings actually did that, right? Because not only is he supposed to himself a copy of the law shall be with him and read it all the days of his life. Of course, we think of that discovery of the lost book in the days of his time. Very few kings obviously did this because most of them, even in Judah, were wicked. All of them in Israel, when they broke off, were wicked. And if they had only done this right here.
Yeah. Well, you got to be thankful that some of those kings, and what weren't even Israelite kings, went back and read some of the old writings, because that's exactly what happened with Haman and Mordecai. Is, the king's just having the archives read to him, and he's kind of like, well, what's been done for this person? Mordecai kind of put down that internal rebellion for him. So it serves a purpose to review your documents. Yes, sir.
So this is a question. Why is it now that God, he goes ahead and sets up rules for a potential king that he knows Israel will ask for? Where in 1 Samuel, when they ask for a king, he kind of makes it known that it's not he makes known that they're doing this because they're rejecting him. Why is he almost cool with it now, but not as much in the future?
This goes in my study this week, and I'm looking at some of these really, really unusual laws, and there's some unusual ones, like the two men that are fighting, and the wife of one comes in and lays hand on a man and injures him, I guess. And you're like, how many times did that happen that it needed to be in the body of law? Or did God just know beforehand that there was going to be a circumstance that happened, so he put that law in there? So I think the point is like God kind of knows human nature. He knows which way they're going to go, and they're not going to make the wisest decision. But he still puts the parameters up to allow them to make, the right decision. Because, God's supposed to be one, he said choose the king. He chose David. He let them choose Saul first, right? And they chose for all the wrong reasons. So I think it's the same way in our life is God gives us a law and he gives us a space to obey it. Are we coming closer to it or are we getting further away from it? And in that sense, we're exercising our free will and our judgment and maybe learning, the benefit behind the law and keeping it. Where it would have been wiser to heed.
Some similarities here to the divorce law that Moses put forth, which of course God was the one who crafted that. And certainly it wasn't that God was in favor of divorce, but we find out in the New Testament because of the hardness of your heart. We find out in Samuel, because you did not want me for a king, you're asking for your king. So again, it's God who, for him, there is no time. He lives in the present, the future, and the past. He is all things at all times. But he makes it so that we have, like you said, parameters to be able to live within to obey him at the time.
I don't know if this is a good parallel or not, Sam, but I can give you this. I know that the people that instituted the laws at the beginning of this country and set up this infrastructure for us did a complete survey of human nature and history and the failures of all kinds of forms of government, and largely around the immorality of man himself. One of the phrases that frequently surfaced back then was that virtue was not hereditary. That's an observation you can make from the Israelite kings. Just because you had a good one didn't mean the next one was going to be good. Solomon even questioned who was going to come after him. So here's the point. Knowing the nature of man, some of the founders, in their writings would say things like, well, just wait until the people find out that they can vote themselves money from the treasury. Well, they knew that could happen. They knew it was probably going to be human nature for that to happen, but they didn't put a bar up in the way to keep it from happening, which you find interesting. And that's just man's wisdom and foresight, not God's wisdom and foresight. But I would say he does everything that he can do to make a person be without excuse, because he gives the guidelines. Yes, sir?
Isn't it just kind of another example of God's foreknowledge in Scripture? I mean, he knows what everyone's going to choose. He doesn't choose it for us. He knows it's not his desire. He knows later it's going to be their strong desire. And even the way the text words it, when the Lord your God has given you the land and you possess it, dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations around me. That's what you're going to do. And you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your brethren. But it's like, there's God's foreknowledge. This is what you're going to want when you get there. But this is, when you do have a king, this is what you need to have in a king. This is what this is what is allowed and not allowed. But I think it's just
embedded within that is some maturity and growth as a people, I think, right? And the point again about him giving them the space to still exercise, righteousness, but it's, their free will. You understand what I'm saying? It's sort of, we do it with our kids, right? At 3 years old, we wouldn't give them a certain task that they're not capable of handling. They get a little bit older, they get a little bit more explanation. In the beginning, when Timmy goes for the outlet, the answer is just no. He doesn't understand what would happen in consequence. So with a little more time and a little more understanding, you kind of expect them to come to some conclusions on their own. And I guess that's the point. You're going to reach this point in your development where you're going to want what everybody else has. And if you have it, you still need to have it, according to righteousness, the right kind, the good kind. I think I see a lot of that from the time that God walked with Adam to the time you get to the flood. There just seems to me some overall maturity of human experience and things that fell down to people. And isn't that why the law of Christ would have come after the law of Moses? Because all the little bitty no-nos were back then. Jesus sort of took that in summation to two principles. This is just how you love your neighbor and how you love God, because by that point in time they ought to have more understanding in their maturity. We're supposed to do the same thing in our Christian understanding, right? When I was a child, I spake as a child. So anyway, I just think, yes, in their maturity and their development and their progression and their growth, they should still seek righteousness and the right ways to do that. Number 7. What detestable things of the Canaanite nations are forbidden in Deuteronomy 18, 9-14. And it says, what New Testament instructions do we have to suggest that these things are still detestable? These are your charmers and your wizards and your necromancers and, these mystical kinds of people that supposedly can give you answers from the other side. And then where are Israel's people supposed to get their answers from? They call for a prophet, right? We just studied the Balaam and Balak and somebody wanting a message besides the one that God wanted the people to have. So I guess the question there is, what New Testament instructions do we have to suggest that these things are still detestable? Did anybody find a New Testament reference for that? Like the witchcraft? Yeah.
21. Then you got Philip's encounter with Simon the sorcerer there in Samaria in Acts 8.
Yeah. That covers it. And a lot of people are taken by that sort of stuff. Probably because it gives a false sense of hope. This is what the calendar says, and so this is what's going to be, and you place a false hope in a false thing. Number 8, how is Deuteronomy 18, 15-20 applicable for every prophet? We kind of touched on this a minute ago. But he says, consider Peter's inspired sermon in Acts 3, 22-26. And so how did he apply this to Jesus? So what about the Deuteronomy 18, 15-20 was applicable for every prophet? We kind of touched this a little while ago. Let's not go back to what he said coming true. And so Peter's deal, it's just 4 verses, so I can read that for you. Acts 3, 22-26. It says, for Moses truly said unto the fathers, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me. Him shall ye hear in all things whatsoever he shall say unto you. And it shall come to pass that every soul which will not hear that prophet shall be destroyed from among the people. Yea, and all the prophets from Samuel and those that follow after, as many as have spoken, have likewise foretold of these days. You are the children of the prophets, and of the covenant which God made with our fathers, saying unto Abraham, and in thy seed shall all the kindreds of the earth be blessed. Unto you first, God, having raised up his Son Jesus, sent him to bless you, and turning away every one of you from his iniquities. So the quotation, what Peter quotes here, it clearly says all prophets from Samuel to here, every single one of them have spoken about this one prophet that was to come, and the people that reject him shall be destroyed from among the people. So that kind of covers all the bases. There wasn't an exception, right? Everybody kind of forecasted that same thing. Sort of difficult to get inside the mind of another person and know exactly what he was trying to extract from that, but how would you say that he applied it to Jesus? Would you word it somehow differently, Jesse?
Did you say Jesse or Jason?
I did.
No.
I could say Jason. That's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go to Jason. Does anybody foresee a different way? I just said all the prophets forecasted the same concept regarding that prophet that was to come. It's the beginning of Hebrews, right? I got a hand, half a hand. No?
Yeah. Well, that Jesus was obviously the ultimate prophet from God. God communicated with Jesus. He did the same with Moses, personally. And they both, heralded in a new law.
So that's yes, another hand.
It was also talking, Jesus spent a lot of time talking about the fact that he spoke what his Father spoke. He only spoke what his Father spoke. He and the Father were one in the things. And part of the thing here that it talks about is the prophet speaking presumptuously, not speaking what the Father in fact spoke. And in New Testament times, that was a big problem. It was always a problem, but it became a problem in New Testament times also when the false teachers would come through and they'd say, I'm speaking for this and I'm speaking for that, and they weren't. And so there was a way to deal with those folks.
So 2 Peter and Jude both address that exact same issue. There were false teachers of old and there are false teachers today. The main likeness, right, between Moses and Jesus is, like you were saying a minute ago, he was the mediator, he was the lawgiver. That's a completely different role. We talked about that some when Moses, you could tell the way that he exercised his office was not the same way that it was for his inheritor. He still had to go to the priesthood, but Moses stood in that position just like Jesus, as king and priest. He is both roles. And so I think that's what he was kind of wanting to pull out in that question, is that they're both the mediator, they're both the lawgiver. That's what sets them completely apart and different from just any other prophet. Yes, sir?
I think it's interesting how in the last verse of the chapter it mentions that if there is a prophet who says something that doesn't come to pass, says you shall not fear him. Like whatever God he claims to answer to, or whatever power he claims to have, you don't need to worry about that. And for the Israelites, it's a very, a physical, tangible test. Either what they say is true or it's not.
And what is the time window on that, right? Gamaliel, that's where Gamaliel was talking to the council, and he said, and I can't remember the people's names, but he said, there was the day that this person arose, and he had followers that went after him, and then, he ended, and all his people dissipated. So his point was this happened twice in recent memory, that a false teacher came up and drew away some disciples, but when that teacher went away, the disciples went away. And so Gamaliel's point is if this thing's of man, it's going to dissolve on its own with the branch Davidians, y'all remember them? And so after it's gone. But Gamaliel's other point was if it's of God, there's no way you're going to stop it. There's no way.
And I would also point to, Galatians chapter 1, where it mentions that even if an angel, someone who's not a man, even if an angel comes and says something that's not what you have already heard, what Christ has given you, then the angels could be accursed as well. So not only do you just have the basis of whether it's something that's directly from a man that is wrong, that makes you not fear the man, but even if an angel, when the angels interact with humanity, they have to tell them not to be scared. But even if a scary angel comes and talks to you and gives you information that's contrary to what Jesus has already made known, you aren't even supposed to by logic, I wouldn't be worried about the angel, or fear what whatever the angel can do to me, because we know that Jesus is the standard and the source of all knowledge that we ought to have.
So how many false prophets have we had since Jesus? We don't know, right? But we've had a few that have come along and they've stuck, and we still have religions in the place of those men. I can think of at least two really, really large religions of people who claim to be a prophet of later times. They still accept Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, this story, and but you get to Jesus, and he was just a prophet, but not that prophet. And so we have this new prophet, and we have to listen to him. So like you're saying, if you would go back to that admonition in Galatians 1, we wouldn't have any of those standing today. I left myself 9 minutes. So I'm trying to move fast, not trying to talk fast, because I have a bad habit of doing that, but trying to move fast. But what I wanted to do, because I went through this, it was kind of funny. The first time I went through these chapters that followed, and I wrote down these little miscellaneous laws and where they existed, and I was trying to draw lines of comparison there, and I went back to the actual workbook, and all of them were already listed there, and I thought, well, how convenient is that? So I went through it again, and I wrote them down again, but this time I tried to connect them to a principle. And I want to do that because obviously we don't have the time to cover the bulk mass of all of them. So I'm hoping to leave you a window for if you had a question or something that you wanted to share, an observation that you've made about some of these. Some of them are strange. And you're thinking, well, why would God put that in there? How many times did that come up? The concept of you raised the hammer, and the head flew off of the end of the hammer and killed somebody. I mean, how many times did that actually happen? But God made the provision there for, accidental death, which I guess in our society we call manslaughter, right? It's not murder, but it's accidental. There was no malice involved. So God had provision for that in there. One thing I would draw your attention to is Hosea chapter 4 and verse 1. When God has a controversy with the people in the land, or with his people, it's largely connected to the fact that there's no truth, no mercy, or knowledge of God in the land. This is the warning that came through Hosea. And mercy, when we look at God's nature and we say, well, God is holy, and, God, is truth, and he is love, and we try to assemble what God is by these adjectives. Mercy has a connection to a lot of things. Mercy is directly connected to justice. And mercy is directly connected to love. I mean, God so loved the world, right? He sent his son, we obtained mercy. So that's why there's not really just maybe one adjective to really get at the nature of God besides holy, but it's just an all-encompassing, multifaceted diamond, that is God's nature. So I wanted to keep that in mind because a lot of these miscellaneous laws have to do with the concept of mercy. They have to do with the concept of justice. They have to do with the concept of that, well, God loves you, and he just simply wants you to love one another like he loves you. That love your neighbor as yourself. Which takes me to the second principle behind all this, which was Jesus' summation that we already talked about a minute ago. If he says that the great commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and that second is likened to it, that you love your neighbor as yourself. And then he says all the law and the prophets hang on those two principles. So these miscellaneous laws, as obscure and unusual and strange as some of them may seem to be, they exist really for those purposes, to either show us how to love God right or how to love the fellow man right. So when I went through this the second time, I tried to see if I could find the connection to these underlying principles. So just for a quick example, beginning in Deuteronomy 19, the first 13 verses have to do with the cities of refuge, which I just mentioned, somebody's swinging their hammer, chopping their wood, and the head flies off, and it kills somebody. This person's not guilty of murder, so God has given this allocation, this place that he can go, accessible place, we've mentioned that, where they charted on the map, a convenient place that this individual can go to escape the avenger. So this is God, right? Showing mercy, showing his love, showing his understanding. This individual didn't do this intentionally, right? And so these people have a place to go. So I see God's love there. I see mercy there. I see justice there. Because if you kill somebody intentionally, well, God puts life for life under the old law. So you have justice served there. With the landmarks, it's the same thing. Everybody got their inheritance in the land. It was allocated. If you're moving your property marker to encroach on your neighbor and steal from him, God doesn't want you to do that. I see God's love in there. I see God's justice in there. One of the next ones, just again as a matter of principle, a couple of these I put this asterisk on. This is what I want to ask you all about. But about the witnesses, right? You got to have enough witnesses. One person rises up, can lie on somebody, and then somebody gets put to death. That's not really fair. So, from the beginning, they had this concept of 2 or 3 witnesses. All things should be established. This is where he gives the measure, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But there's a phrase in there that said, you shall have no pity. This is not the only time it comes up. The other time, or one of the other times that I read about it was, again, that woman that laid hold on a man to try to protect her husband. She's supposed to have her hand cut off. And he says, and you shall not look on it with pity. Well, it's hard, isn't it? I mean, it's hard. You're thinking, well, this lady was just trying to help her husband out, and he was getting beat up. And you'd want to have a pity on this person. You'd want to be forgiving on this person, but God says you can't. But he understands the human heart and the human nature, and you think that, does the punishment really fit the crime? But he put it in there for us. You should not have pity. And I just want to ask you all about that point, because it recurs a lot in here too, since we've only got 3 minutes left. But what can you make of that kind of a concept? That would be in, I guess, Deuteronomy 19:15 through 21 is one of the first places there. But he warns about that concept several times. Because, he's merciful, but in this particular context, in this particular situation, he says, no, there's not going to be any pity.
Do if you get too soft towards my law. What my law is that you need to carry out in this specific situation that I'm explaining to you the law, but then my pity. And then it's kind of like maybe today he gives us a command to practice church discipline with those who walk disorderly, and well, that challenges us. That challenges, I think, every local church to do that, to apply that. And our sympathies, our pities, and we can talk ourselves out of doing it.
So when you soften the consequences, right, you embolden the criminal, right? So we have certain states that don't enforce certain laws. People can just walk into certain stores and steal up to a certain dollar amount and face no prosecution. Does that decrease theft or does it increase theft? Well, obviously it has increased theft. I think it goes without saying. I don't quote like a lot of men, but Adam Smith wrote a book in the 1700s, and there was a phrase in there, it's the only thing from the entire book that stuck to me, but he says that mercy to the guilty is cruelty to the innocent. And I understand that best when somebody's like, well, there was this criminal that was already a criminal, and they were set free, and they wound up killing somebody else, and it would have never happened if they had stayed in the jail the first time, for example. And so that's what happened, is somebody had a little pity, it was a little soft, the penalty didn't fit the crime, and so this individual not only took a life once, but they took a life twice. And so if you have mercy on the guilty, you're having simultaneously on the other side of that coin cruelty to the innocent. And it is it is sometimes on the surface you think that's just a little thing. I remember defending myself when I was a young father because of the way that I would really just get the attention of the little kids, and they're like, you're kind of harsh on the little kid. I said, but they don't understand the danger. If they're going to run to the middle of the street, or if they're just going to pull something off the table on their head, I just need them to understand stop when I yell their name, right? They don't really understand the implications or the damages that can come from it. I sorely apologize that we couldn't get further into that, because I had a lot of notes. It's very unfortunate. The other thing I really wanted to talk about was that levirate law, because there's a lot of things that God gives in these miscellaneous laws that are animal rights. Not to take the young, or not to take the mother, but take the young, so that the mother, could have more. There was wisdom there. If you're building an embattlement and you're going against a city for a long siege and you're cutting down trees to do it, don't cut down the fruit trees. You're going to be there a while. You need to eat. Just say things like that are in there. But that levirate law, which I always felt like that's just so strange. But man, there's a really good explanation to that in there. And it says if there's a man that won't do it, you take him before the public, you say this thing in front of him, and she's supposed to spit on him for not doing his duty, because God had some wisdom there, some love and some compassion and stuff that he wanted to be shown that somebody refused to do. So I find that purpose behind all the laws, miscellaneous or not.